Halito, so Ojibwe Bethany Hughes, Choctaw Siahoke. Hello, I'm Bethany Hughes. I'm a citizen of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma. I'm an associate professor here in the Department of American Culture and the director of the Native American Studies program. And I get the fun job of being the MC for this event, this third day of our Living with Treaties conference. I have the easiest job. I just get to stand and introduce people and then sit down and listen to all of the wonderful work that's happening. So good morning, and thank you so much for joining us on day 3 of Living with Treaties. We've had fantastic days 1 and 2. As someone who's been in the planning meetings for over a year, it's been really wonderful. Like you have a vision of what's going to happen, and it has surpassed my hopes. So it's really been lovely, and thank you so much for making that possible by showing up. When you came in, you should have gotten a printed program. This program will have all of the sessions and the bios of the participants, maps of this building if you need to figure out where lunch is later, which is very close by. So you can refer to this for anything that you need. Also, if you are interested in cart captioning, on page 5 there is a QR code you can use with your personal device to access cart services. And also the top QR code we would love you to use today, tomorrow, whenever you're thinking about it. It's a post-event survey. You can do these after every session for the whole event, but it's really helpful to us to give us feedback about how these panels and this information and these conversations are impacting you or resonating with you, your work, your life, where you're from, and also give us ideas about how we can improve our work as we go forward. The Living with Treaty Conferences is but yet the start of the 1817 Project public-facing events and programming in the coming years, so we would love your feedback. Today, we are going to continue exploring Indigenous histories and their ongoing significance, while also looking ahead to education, community engagement, and collective action. Also, directly following, so we have 2 panels this morning. Directly following that, our co-PI, my co-PI, Michael Witkin, will say a few brief and informal closing remarks, perhaps. Very informal, which is not a euphemism. It's So now to provide the opening remarks for today of our final conference is Dr. Elizabeth Cole. Dr. Cole is the director of the Philip J. Bowman Center for Scholarship to Practice in the College of Literature, Science, and the Arts here at the University of Michigan. Also University Diversity and Social Transformation Professor of Psychology, Women's and Gender Studies, and Afro-American African Studies, and a co-chair of the University of Michigan's Inclusive History Project. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Elizabeth Cole.
Okay. Thank you so much, Bethany. As co-chair of the Inclusive History Project here at U of M, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the final day of the Living with Treaties conference. We're so happy that you were able to be here joining us on this April Saturday to continue considering the role of treaties in the development of this university and the state of Michigan, and how their effects continue to resonate today. This is the largest and most ambitious of the IHP's public programs to date, and whether this is your very first IHP program or whether you've attended one before, we're glad you're here. Since we have people joining us today who might not have been here on our other days, let me start by telling you a little bit about the IHP. The IHP is a university-wide, multi-year presidential initiative to honestly and critically re-examine the university's full past, stretching across the university's 3 campuses at Flint, Dearborn, and Ann Arbor, and Michigan Medicine. We're working to examine received histories, recontextualize the existing narratives, and center the previously ignored stories, and to bring more of the university's history forward. We think of the IHP as having 3 central imperatives: to research, to engage, and to repair. And we launched activities to pursue these goals 3 years ago. We now have 12 major research projects on the university's past underway, and we have more than 80 people on the research teams for these projects, and they include faculty, staff, and students, as well as community partners from all 3 campuses. Together, we're working across disciplines, colleges and schools, and these campuses to study and share more than 200 years of the university's history. As we pursue this historical research, We work to engage people, both across our campuses and beyond them, to learn about and to learn from the university's history, including through programs like this. We're undertaking these research and engagement efforts to more deeply understand the continuing impact of the university's history on our present, so that our work will lead to recommendations for actions to change U of M's future. Now, this conference in particular is part of one of our foundational research projects called the 1817 Project, Land, Culture, Memory, and Repair. And this project originated in calls to critically examine the early history of the university and the institutional narratives surrounding the land transfer, or the land that the university received from the Anishinaabe communities through the 1817 Treaty of Fort Meigs, also known as the Treaty of the Maumee Rapids. The 1817 project bridges the past, present, and the future by exploring U of M's connections to indigenous land, settler colonialism, and policies of dispossession, as well as contemporary issues of Native American student experience, campus inclusivity, and student activism. If you've been able to join us for the last 3 days, or the last 2 days of the conference, you can see how these themes resonated through our discussions so far. And I want to touch on just a few of them this morning to kind of get us all up to date. You know how they do the recaps at the beginning of a show? So we heard original research conducted by the IHP's 1817 project team, showing how the land that was transferred by the Fort Meigs Treaty was sold by the university to settle their debts, and that money sustained them through a financially precarious time. And we're not only talking about land in southeastern Michigan. The IHP research showed how the university chose plots 100 miles away near what's now Kalamazoo, based on the fertility of that land, because they knew it would be attractive to buyers. And that fertility was made possible through the native care of the land in the past. So even if our university was not literally built on ceded land, it was built through ceded land. And I think that's just sort of a key insight that we've been talking about. The university was directly a beneficiary of native dispossession. We also learned about these treaties themselves, how they were made and how they worked, that they were often signed under coercion, sometimes even with the US military officers standing by. We learned about the ambiguities that are common in the language of treaties and how that's actually a feature, not a bug. If the treaties had been more forthright, natives would probably not have been willing to sign them. We heard Maggie Blackhawk's critique of land acknowledgments for suggesting that the harms to Native communities took place in the past, when in fact these harms are ongoing. But we also heard from attorneys who've spent their whole careers representing tribes in their ongoing legal efforts to make sure that both state and federal governments made good on the rights that the treaties affirmed. And although these battles were grueling and long, sometimes they've been successful. And then in what might have been the most inspiring session so far, we heard from members of the Little Traverse Bay bands of Odawa Indians about what the land means to them and how difficult it is to articulate the value of kinship and ancestral connection they place on it, the responsibility they feel towards it. These are values that cannot be reduced to commodities. They told us about their efforts to buy back their land, to make it possible to return home and honor their ancestors. These narratives helped us imagine a future in which some of these immeasurable harms begin to be repaired. Now, I know we're all eager to continue our conversations about these important issues, and before we do so, I want to just take a moment to extend our gratitude and our recognition to the co-principal investigators of the 1817 project, to Professor Bethany Hughes, who you just heard from, to Eric Hemingway, and to Professor Michael Wicken. You've seen and heard from them throughout this conference, but their leadership on this project and their contributions of their deep expertise, of their time, of their wisdom, of their savvy, and I think you saw it illustrated here, their good humor, stand behind this work and have brought us to this moment and this opportunity. So thank you, Bethany, thanks to Eric, and thanks to Michael. And now I am happy to turn the podium over to Michael Wicken, who will moderate this morning's first panel. Thanks, Michael.
Would you? I'm Michael Wicken. I'm a citizen of the Red Cliff Band of Lake Superior, Ojibwe. I'm a professor at Columbia University. Before that, I was a professor here in History Department and Native American Studies for about 18 years. So today we're going to talk about, with this panel today, we're going to talk about thinking about Indian removal from a Great Lakes perspective. And I'm going to introduce briefly two of our speakers today, and then we'll kind of talk briefly about the panel, and then I will turn it over to the speakers. We're going to hear from Blair Mauricio Tapash, who is a citizen of Pokagon Band of Boodewaadamii Indians, assistant professor of the Department of Religious Studies at Michigan State University, where she is affiliate faculty in Digital Humanities and American Indian Indigenous Studies. She previously worked as her tribe's first full-time archivist. We're also going to hear from Winona Single. Winona is an associate professor of law at Michigan State University College of Law and director of the Indigenous Law and Policy Center. She teaches federal Indian law, property, and other courses related to natural resources and environmental sciences and indigenous rights and human rights. The panel that we're going to do today is, like I said, looking at Great Lakes or Indian removal from a Great Lakes perspective. I think especially if you have a kid who's gone through any kind of standard public education system where you get kind of the American Indian History Survey and you get the meta-narrative of American history in your elementary school, your junior high school, your high school, one standard piece that you'll get is the Indian removal piece, which is going to usually be a Trail of Tears. It's a way in which you can kind of have an early American history where Indians matter at the kind of discovery period. Indians matter again in the 7 Years' War. Indians matter at the Revolution. Then Indians kind of exit center stage till Indian removal. They're brought back in for that tragic last act with the Trail of Tears, and then we can leave them out of the picture of a sort of meta-narrative of American history until the Great Plains. That is not actually too accurate, and one of the things we wanted to address are the people in the Great Lakes, many of whom fought to stay in their homelands, including the Burt Lake Band of Odawa and Ojibwe Indians, the Pokagon Band of Boodewaadamii Indians, who fought to stay in their homelands, fought to maintain their community, their sovereignty, and they fought through this early period of removal, but also into the present day. Another important aspect of the panel is we want to link that. I think the other kind of big critique I would have of the way Indigenous history gets taught or incorporated into the sort of standard history education curriculums is this thing that happens in the past as opposed to a thing that's still happening in the future. But we want to talk about these experiences, how different Indigenous peoples in Michigan managed to stay in their homelands, avoid removal. This was in part a strategy that they employed, finding ways to create a right to stay in their homelands, organize their community, preserve their community. It also occurred because there became a time period in Michigan history when the citizen settlers of Michigan realized they could make a lot of money by having Indigenous people in their homelands. Or in their home state because of the annuity payments. That is sort of annual payments in cash and trade goods that were supposed to be dispensed for land cession treaties, usually for periods like 20 years or so. This became a way for traders and merchants to claim that land or claim those monies as debt from past trading. It became a way for them to sell the provisions that were going to the tribes to the federal government. So it became a way of making money. So you had Indigenous people fighting to stay in their homeland. You had settlers who found a certain value to having Native people there as opposed to pushing them out and removal. And we want to kind of explore those histories today, thinking specifically about Pokagon Band, Boodewaadamii, and Burt Lake Band. So with that, should we have everybody come up and have a seat or take the podium and then take a seat? Okay. We'll start out with Winona. You want to come up first? And
Okay, so click here. Thank you. All right, thank you so much, Professor Wicken. I appreciate the very kind introduction. And so my focus today is going to be on removal in Michigan, and I'm also a Little Traverse Bay Band's tribal member, so Winona Single Anishinaabe, and also I just want to talk about the continuity that exists between forcible removal in southern Michigan, as well as how that connects to the community at Burt Lake through my own family. And then also, I'd like to connect that to the Indian boarding school era as well. And so this is also a personal, history for me as well, since my ancestors lived at Burt Lake. And so I just want to share what I think is a very important part of our nation's history. The story is real and it matters enormously. So first of all, I want to explain that in terms of the Burt Lake, I'm going to talk about this in different phases. My slides look overly polished, I apologize, but the first is divergence. And so I want to emphasize how when Indian removal happened in Michigan, not all outcomes were the same. And so I'm going to do a short comparison with the Pokagon Band, which I know Professor Topash will also talk about, and what happened with other tribal members in South Central Michigan. And then I'll also talk about the work that the tribe did to protect its ability to remain in Michigan, and also a part of the story that's often omitted, which is their deep use of civic engagement and their very sophisticated presence legally using state laws to protect their community, but also through an Anishinaabe lens as well. And then also, I'd like to talk about the burnout and some of its outcomes. So first off, as I mentioned, I wanted to do a short comparison. So with the Pokagon Band, as I imagine Professor Blair Topash may discuss, we had the leader of the Pokagon Band, Ogama Leopold Pokagon. He, at the Treaty of 1833, when provisions were included within that treaty for the removal of tribal members to the west, Leopold Pokagon negotiated first a supplement and then a later addendum, and he wanted to ensure that the tribe would be able to to remain in Michigan. And so he ultimately negotiated for a provision that allowed for the Pokagon Band tribal members to continue to receive their annuities in Michigan. It was contemplated that they would move north to the homelands of Little Traverse Bay Bands, but also argued and strategically used the community's participation in the Catholic faith as part of the justification for their ability to remain in Michigan, and was successful. And so ultimately, when the Department of War Secretary charged U.S. military Brigadier General Hugh Brady with responsibility for removing Michigan Indians at all costs under any circumstances in 1840, there was a moment when the Pokagons were very concerned about possible forcible removal of their community. And so they responded by Leopold Pokagon spoke with then Michigan Associate Justice Epaphroditus Ransom and said, look, we have these additional supplements and addenda that we negotiated to the Treaty of 1833. We are not to be removed. We agreed to continue receiving our annuities here in Michigan. And so Epaphroditus Ransom, the justice, met with Brigadier General Hugh Brady, and Hugh Brady agreed not to submit them to forcible removal. So the Pokagon Band to this day remains in southwest Michigan and shows us that removal was not absolute. It was contingent, and it was not inevitable. And then in contrast to that is the story of Michigan tribal members in South Central Michigan who also experienced the threat of forcible removal by that same order to Brigadier General Hugh Brady in 1840. In that case, we do have many accounts of tribal members who were forcibly rounded up throughout central and south central Michigan in communities that we frequently just do not acknowledge or document that this happened. And in many cases, the descriptions of that forcible removal come from settler accounts. And so those settler accounts, of course, are imbued with biases about the inevitability of this removal and about a belief, a trust that it was a benevolent form of emigration from Michigan. And so I don't want to elevate too much the accounts of settlers, but there are definitely multiple detailed accounts of hundreds and hundreds of Native people fleeing, and I'm talking about fleeing in Mason, Michigan, while Marion Turner's sister was a school teacher, and she wrote that hundreds and hundreds of Native people and women and children were walking on both sides of the schoolhouse while they were teaching the class, and they later realized these were people that were fleeing removal, and that also there are accounts in Okemos and accounts in, of course, Charlotte, Michigan, and in Marshall and Athens, and of course in Battle Creek, and in Lansing, and so we have many of these accounts that. And I really feel strongly that this is a very important part of our public history that we do not acknowledge, that we absolutely have to document, and that the public in our nation and in our state needs to recognize. And so during that time period, I fortunately am able to know that my ancestor, Antoine Shenaniquet, was taken in southern Michigan around this time. I cannot know with certainty that he lost his family due to forcible removal or disease or perhaps some other consequence, but I do know that he was taken as an orphan by the Windigoish family, another Anishinaabe family that took him to Burt Lake in northern Michigan when he was, quote, a half-grown boy. And so it was at approximately the same time of forcible removal in southern Michigan. And in addition to that, I just want to emphasize that when doing so, the Windigoish family was acting in accordance with Anishinaabe traditional norms about responsibility to children and responsibility to maintain kinship ties. There was no question that there was an obligation to care for a child who had been orphaned. And so my third great-grandfather, Antoine, was taken to Burt Lake and ultimately became lived a very long life at the community and had many, many descendants, one of whom is me. And so I just want to show that also a lot of this happened in the immediate aftermath of the 1838 Potawatomi Trail of Death, which also affected Michigan tribal members, but which specifically did begin in Indiana. And people knew that there were tremendous loss of life. Approximately 5% of all Anishinaabe on the Trail of Death died during that forced march. And in addition to that, many more died after they arrived from a variety of causes. And so in addition to that, I want to emphasize that my ancestor Antoine's name, Shenaniquet, is documented and misspelled in lots of different ways by U.S. Census takers. But I also think it is striking that his name Shenaniquet comes from Jawanong, and Jawanong means from the south. And in Anishinaabemowin, our language encodes legal obligations and kinship structures and relationships to the land. And so in a way, for the rest of his life, he was known as someone who came from the south. And so I do think that that's a way that the community remembered something that is not recorded in our legal system and is not legible if you were to look at the official archives, which did not effectively document what happened as a result of removal. You know, our archives document people by identifying male heads of households and then essentially providing just numbers of women and children for every head of household that was identified on a muster roll for forcible removal. So completely negating any recognition of the kinship relationships and the important identities of those women and children, and also completely negating not just the individual units of heads of household, but the interrelationship of kinship and the clans that everyone was a member of. None of that is recalled or documented. And of course, there were important destructive impacts to all of that as a result of forcible removal in Michigan. And so I also want to emphasize that when the Burt Lake community, after Burt Lake community had existed there for many, many years. And so it's well documented that they impacted the land and resources in significant ways. But we also know that Aki in Anishinaabe is our word for land, and it does not just mean earth. It does not just mean the ground. It's a living relational system that includes all beings on the earth, animate and inanimate, and it includes all beings that have lived on the earth and all beings that are to come. And it's not just a term that denotes an object or a life. It's a term that comes with and is deeply embedded with an Anishinaabe perspective on obligation and relationship. And in addition to that, I point to K.K. Stark, who also writes about Nakondazwag, and I apologize if I have not pronounced that correctly, but it defines trust as an action by which someone reflects upon reciprocally in fulfilling their duties, obligations, and responsibilities to each other. And I think that that's really striking because what the community at Burt Lake did is they acquired title to their land at Burt Lake from the General Land Office. And so they did not obtain allotments through the Treaty of 1855. They purchased fee simple title, but they arranged for that to be conveyed directly to the governor of Michigan. And so they may have been using an Anishinaabe perspective on trust and reciprocal obligations and protection in doing so. And so they conveyed their land, had it conveyed to the governor in trust for their benefit, and they weren't the only ones to do so. The Nineteenth-century Band of Boodewaadamii, they had done the exact same thing as well. And the Nineteenth-century Band's lands, once conveyed to the governor of Michigan, were deemed to be exempt from property taxes because they were essentially publicly held. And where there's a major difference in treatment with the Burt Lake Band, where those lands were ultimately, in later years, deemed to be subject to property taxes, and that led, of course, to the tax foreclosure sale of those tribal members' property, and ultimately the burning of the village. And I just want to document, too, that as Burt Lake was living in the community, it was well recognized that tribal member tenure to land was very unstable in Michigan and was often challenged by non-native settlers. And so where tribal members used the Homestead Act in communities in Emmett County and in Charlevoix County, et cetera, to develop their homesteads under the Homestead Act, Margaret Boyd, tribal member from Little Traverse and a leader in the community, she wrote letters and then went and met with the president of the United States to say, look, we have tribal members who refuse to cut down their sugar bush because it's so important. And then when they refuse to cut down their sugar bush, the local community says, you have not fulfilled the Homestead Act's requirement of cultivation, and you are therefore not entitled to ownership of your property. And so and in addition to that, tribal members at that time were not deemed competent to be witnesses in Michigan courts, and so they weren't even able to testify in the courts, as documented by Margaret Boyd. And yet, the maple sugar was incredibly important, and these are my ancestors and community members at Burt Lake. In 1860, this is from the agricultural record of Burt Lake. This amount of maple sugar is nowhere near the quantities that non-native settlers in the area had. It was so important to them culturally and economically as well. And so I just want to emphasize also that the community at Burt Lake has often been portrayed after what's called the Burt Lake burnout, when their village was burned, as being lazy and uninformed and as being unsophisticated and unable to understand their obligations to pay taxes. Even in an article published in the Michigan History magazine by a fifth-generation Burt Lake descendant, Matthew Friday, he also says, hey, the Burt Lake burnout may have been immoral, but it was legal. But he describes the failure to pay property taxes as based on tribal ignorance and misunderstanding. Nothing could be further from the truth. The tribal community was deeply engaged and sophisticated, and they also participated in the civic life of the community under state law. And so my Antoine Shenaniquet was a township supervisor of Burt Township. Tribal members petitioned to build a bridge. Moses Hamlin was the highway commissioner. And in one account by a non-native settler, there was a statement that, oh my goodness, I went to vote and the whole election board was Indian. And then Paul Nanguesca was elected constable of Burt Township. So lots of civic engagement by the community, very sophisticated. And so this is a picture of my ancestors. Antoine is the second from the left, and my third great grandmother, Sophie Shenandoah, is the elderly woman in the center. And this is them at Burt Lake. And so also what's not documented in the, a lot of public documents of this, but what is evident from the archives, the National Archives records of the actual litigation that occurred regarding the tax foreclosure claim, is that the tribal members actually collected tax money when they were told by the local county non-native settler that now you do owe property taxes on this land that the governor's holding in trust for you. And so Joseph Webwidam, who actually, Webwidam is another name for Windigowish, the same family that adopted my third great grandfather. He was township appraiser, and he went through the community and collected tax money and presented it to the non-native settler county treasurer, Maltby, who refused to accept the money. This is the statement of the U.S. Attorney for the Western District of Michigan in litigation. And they were told, no, your lands are not taxable. We refuse to accept your money. Well, then, of course, ultimately, John McGinn is someone who actually ran to be the tax assessor for Sheboygan County, and he's the lumber speculator that ultimately pushed to obtain title to the land through the tax foreclosure. And so ultimately, the tribal members did not pay taxes, and subsequently their lands were sold at a tax foreclosure sale. Lumber speculator John McGinn purchased those lands, and he also was accompanied by the sheriff of Sheboygan County, Fred Ming, and several others who poured kerosene on all of the homes in the village and burned them all down. And then subsequent, prior to that, when the initial lawsuit was brought in the local Sheboygan court by my ancestor, by John McGinn, the community, 23 members of the community signed a legal answer in Sheboygan court. They were not ignorant of the law or sitting on their rights without taking any action. And in fact, of those 23 people who signed a response to John McGinn's petition, 7 of them I know are of relations of mine. And so they were standing in court together to defend their property rights. And ultimately, the Sheboygan County Court concluded that the land was subject to tax foreclosure and was rightfully conveyed to John McGinn. And so this is then, of course, when the burnout occurred. There's a reference to the fact that in one of the newspapers, some of the squaws are over 80 years of age. That was a reference to my third great grandmother, Sophia Shenandoah. And then we know that there are many instances when the law was honored for some, but not in other cases. And so it was dependent upon negotiation and strategy, and also was very vulnerable to coordinated attacks on continued Indigenous presence in Michigan. And so one of my arguments is also that federal Indian law accumulates the effect on Native families, from forcible removal to their attempt to survive and thrive at Burt Lake, to their experience of having their entire village burned down in 1900. That's an accumulation of harm that transfers from generation to generation. And in addition, to show that continuity, I have here one of the applications for one of the Burt Lake descendants, Robert Shenandoah. And this is his application to attend the Mount Pleasant Industrial Indian School in 1920, 20 years after the burnout. And you can see that John T. McGinn, the son of John McGinn, the lumber speculator who acquired the property, he signed the affidavit to have a child at Burt Lake sent to the Mount Pleasant Indian School. And so you see that even the next generation after John McGinn continued to press for another form of removal, in this case, the removal to take children from their families and place them into the boarding schools. So We know this is one of the houses that did survive the burnout. It is on the grounds of the Sheboygan County History Museum. And these are my two boys and Matthew's two boys, Owen and Emmett, standing in front of that. And so we are very much committed to not allowing the erasure of this important history from continuing. And also, we recognize a lot of work has been done by Richard Wells and by the University of Michigan and by Eric Hemingway and many others to describe what happened. But I also hope that my work is contributing to a deeper understanding of how this fits into the continuity of federal Indian law's intergenerational harm on Native families. So thank you so much. And this is my last slide, so I appreciate your time. Miigwech.
Thank you, Winona. Now we'll hear from Blair Mosso. Tabash.
Fantastic. Hi, everyone. How are you? Good to see you here on an early Saturday morning. Bojo Jayak, Blair Morsel, Indigenous, Minem Ko, Kwe, Anishinaabe Noswin, Ko Indinodem, Pokagon Band. I am introducing myself in Boodewaadamii, which is similar to Anishinaabe, but better. No, I'm just kidding. And in that introduction, that was just my name. Just kidding. At this point, that's like a dad joke. We introduce ourselves and our clans and where we're enrolled, and we say, that was just my name. But no, my name is Blair Morsaw. I am a citizen of Pokagon Boodewaadamii, and I'm really grateful to Winona for sharing some of the history of my community, because I'm actually not going to talk much about the history. I'm going to talk about futurisms and futurity. They just invited me here to talk about science fiction stuff, so I'm happy to do so. And as was mentioned, I am here from Michigan State University. Go green. Okay. You're supposed to say go white. All right. And I'm housed in religious studies, but I also teach in American Indian and Indigenous studies. I'm also a affiliate faculty in digital humanities, which, if there's time or interest, I'm happy to talk about some recent projects because I've recently made the shift from traditional publishing after my first book on mapping Anishinaabe futurity to focusing on community-based digital humanities efforts, one of which is an app that makes the constellations of Potawatomi communities more accessible. So what you might see as Orion, we will see as Nanikbos, and so on. So anyway, I'll get started here. And as I mentioned, my scholarship is in Indigenous futurisms. I'm trained as a cultural anthropologist, so I'm steeped in a field that has, for a very long time, treated Indigenous peoples as anachronisms or outside of the present time. And for a long time, we've been pushing back to say that we are not inauthentic, our cultures are not savage when we participate in contemporary culture or technology or ways of being, and pushing the envelope a little bit further to say, in fact, we have a very valid place in the future. And so the key argument I make in most of my scholarship is that while it's really fun to watch science fiction, especially Indigenous-made science fiction in film, literature, artwork, video games, we need that as one arm of Indigenous futurism, and then the political advocacy as the other, because both of these things imagine alternative futures from the bullshit we have to deal with today, right? So My role in this conversation is a little bit different from that of a historian or a legal scholar. I want to think about this panel in terms of how Indian removal looks from a Great Lakes perspective, when we focus not only on policy and law, but also lived experience, community continuity, and Indigenous futures. So often when we think about treaties, and I'm sure this is something that has been brought up in the previous 2 days of this conference, is that they are agreements that are anchored in an acknowledgement of sovereignty. So what does sovereignty mean to Indigenous peoples today in terms of food sovereignty, bodily sovereignty, language sovereignty? Oh, I was told not to touch the computer and I accidentally did. I'm sorry. Just use this. Okay. I think also it was interesting, Winona, you mentioned the Potawatomi Trail of Death occurring, 8 years after the formal Indian Removal Act of 1830. And what you're seeing here with this unfinished sketch is a gathering of Potawatomi peoples in northern Indiana in 1837. So just prior to this, I imagine some of these people pictured here, while we don't have their names, are probably ancestors of some of the folks who are now in Kansas or Oklahoma. And it was a sketch made by George Winter, who basically hung out with a bunch of Native folks in 1837 in northern Indiana, painted a bunch of works that now exist in, I think, the Tippecanoe Historical Society. But the Pokagon Band has one of his works, which is this unfinished sketch. So when many people hear Indian removal, they picture a single model, a state policy or forced transportation from east to west. That history matters, of course, but from a Great Lakes perspective, removal often worked through a broader set of pressures and strategies, both what we would see as formal in the historical record and informal. For example, the Pokagon Band is often known as well as presents themselves as, the unremoved Potawatomi of this region, or at least one of the unremoved. But of course, that is because of some of the savvy property purchasing moves of Leopold Pokagon and others, because we were removed. We were forced to go north by some Odawa folks near Traverse City, I believe. They had just ceded their land, so we were shit out of luck. So we went back south, and some leaders had used annuity payments to purchase private property, because the United States loves private property. And that was, if they weren't going to respect Indigenous sovereignty, they might respect private property. And so that was part and parcel, that was not a pun intended, but I'll appreciate that one, to how we are still able to be here today. For those of you familiar with Pokagon history, you know that that was a very oversimplified telling, but the point still stands. Removal could involve settler encroachment, speculative land transfers, pressure through treaties, military force, boarding schools, and later struggles over recognition and jurisdiction. So we are 200 years, a little over 200 years after the focus of this Living with Treaties conference, and we are still in the processes of a tribe of buying back our own land, right? And it's not a simple process. Of course, we're one of the few federally recognized tribes that has a casinos that are profitable, despite the stereotype and association of casinos with Indigenous peoples. And we're in a position where we can buy certain parcels of land. But then even the process of turning that into trust land, AKA Indian land, is not straightforward and not guaranteed. So the broader framing of this is very much in keeping with the panel's description, with the larger conference focus on dispossession, treaty, history, and the continuing effects of those histories into the present. And in this slide, I wanted to focus on just a few of many different ways of actualizing sovereignty. In the first picture, you see Kaya Deerenwater, who is a citizen of the Citizen Band of Oklahoma, a citizen band of Potawatomi of Oklahoma, I'm sorry, engaging in what he does, which is food sovereignty work, urban community gardening, education about our traditional foods, which of course is tied with land back movements, health. Often when we think about land being returned to tribes or to their original stewards, we call it repatriation. But we don't think about the ancestral seeds, the sort of near extinct relatives of our traditional foods wasting away in botany drawers in places like the University of Michigan that would be, if returned, rematriated rather than patriated, right? Because these are typically women's roles. And then also, of course, place-based relationships, whether that is playing games, communing with one another, and then I'm a big proponent of anything that involves language revitalization. So you see another teacher here giving a lesson probably at the Potawatomi gathering. And so when I addressed you all, I said Jayak, but I also said Indoimaganaduk, which most people translate to relative in English, but if you break it down, really means you who sounds like me. Because one important way of relating to each other is not just what tribe you're enrolled in, who your family is, who your clan is, but also because language shapes the way that you think and relate to the world. If you speak Potawatomi, then that in one way makes you my relative, or Anishinaabe, right? So that sound is really important in the way that we relate to each other in the world. I want to emphasize that removal should not be narrated as if it succeeded in making Indigenous peoples disappear. The comparison in this session is powerful because it highlights the Pokagon Band of Boodewaadamii and the Burt Lake Band of Odawa and Ojibwe experienced removal and federal recognition differently. And those differences shaped distinct historical paths. But distinct paths are not evidence of absence. They are evidence of survival under unequal and shifting circumstances. So one thing a Great Lakes perspective helps us see is that Michigan was never simply a post-Indian space. Indigenous communities remained, adapted, resisted, organized, remembered, and continued to assert sovereignty. Presence itself is a part of the story. So as I mentioned, I am trained as a cultural anthropologist, and so I'm interested in how structures like removal are lived and understood within communities across generations. And so intergenerational knowledge transfer is really important to me, and as hard as it might be, I often bring my son, Mixani, here to different work events, mostly because I have to, but also I think it's actually quite weird to be in only adult spaces or only child spaces. It's not really an Indigenous way of doing things, to have those things have such very, what's the word? I don't know, just distinct spaces between the two. Winona mentioned the word aki, meaning earth, or clay, or homelands, depending on how you use it or conjugate it. And it's also a particle of the word kenamagawen, in Potawatomi instead of aki. So kenamagawen means teaching or learning, And it refers to, if you break it down literally, the earth demonstrates or shows us in the present. And so some people get really romantic about it, and they're like, this is because we learn from the earth and it's our original teacher. And I don't think that's not true, but also because traditionally, when lessons were being mapped out and diagrammed, our elders would show it on the dirt and trace it on the dirt. So I think both are true. But this points to the intergenerational knowledge sharing that occurs between elders and younger folks. So back to cultural anthropology and indigenous futurisms. I'm interested in questions like, how are these histories remembered? How are they taught in families and communities? How do people maintain relationships to place even under conditions of dispossession? And how do sovereignty and recognition get experienced, not only in courts and archives, but in everyday life of the people who are still here? Anthropology can help us attend to the social and cultural dimensions of what removal does, and also what communities do in response. It lets us see not only state policy, but indigenous persistence. And that latter is one of my favorite ways of engaging with the world. Of course, I do what I can to become as familiar with the Potawatomi language as possible, with my own history, not just for myself, but for my son. And, hopefully if he decides to have children, then his children. But I find a lot of creative energy in what other indigenous peoples produce about ways of seeing the future, because I would argue that in order to enact or actualize a future better than the one that we're living in, we have to first imagine it. So this can happen through creative media, often seen as very lowbrow or things that are escapist, not relevant to what we should really be engaging with. I couldn't argue more, or I couldn't disagree more. I think these are really powerful sites of engagement, whether it's in the left, upper left here, we have Desba Rose, who is Navajo or Diné, and she is, I'm sure she does other things, but she's famous on social media as a cosplayer, in a very simple way, indigenizing maybe pop cultural references, what you might recognize here from the Star Wars franchise, but of course, she has her own traditional Navajo moccasins. You can't see it, but she also has her hair in a traditional Navajo bun. The upper right is a role-playing game similar to the mechanics of Dungeons and Dragons, but it's set in a fantastical future where the colonization of the Americas never occurred. So it opens players' minds to different ways of engaging with not even decolonized, a not colonized world and what that could look like. And then finally, and this is not an exhaustive display of indigenous futurist work, but at the bottom is work by Jemez Pueblo and Korean artist Deborah Yepa Papan, where she is mirroring an Edward Curtis style representation of Native peoples as stoic, unsmiling, still, in the past, of course, living in the plains, but that's not my traditional culture or hers. But then disrupting that narrative through a Vulcan salute or hello. We've got the Enterprise in the background and other Star Trek insignia in this piece. And she has a whole series of work similar to this, where she also uses Doctor Who and Hello Kitty and other things like that. So bringing indigenous futurisms in, I don't want it to seem like a narrow genre. There are many different ways of engaging with it. And if you have questions about that, be careful, because I will talk for a long time. So here I'm using indigenous futurisms more as a method or lens. It asks, what futures were settler policies trying to foreclose? And I think it's important, if you take nothing away from what I say today, except one thing, let it be this. what we've normalized as Indian policy or ways of being an American, a US citizen, and what we expect out of this life, know that that was designed as a settler futurity. So what we're planning, what we're baking into policy is meant to affect a future. And so this is not Indigenous futurisms intervening into an imagined day, but directly confronting what we have normalized as acceptable in this country. And so what futures have Indigenous communities imagined? What have they protected, and what have they built anyway, despite the circumstances? These matter because removal is not only about the past, it is also about whether a people will be allowed to remain politically, territorially, and imaginatively present. Indigenous futurisms helps us to see that the struggle is not only over what happened, but over what kinds of Indigenous life remain possible and on whose terms. And in that sense, sovereignty is never just about formal recognition, although it's very important. It is also about the capacity to sustain relations to land, to ancestors, to descendants, and to collective futures. What you're seeing here is a map. I'm going to forget the name, but it's housed at the Newberry Library. It's definitely 18th century, although I don't remember the exact year. And it's one of my favorite maps, even though I don't remember the name or the year. But one, because they're beautiful. These old maps are really astonishing to look at, but also because it's one of the examples of the ways in which early European explorers, colonizers, etc., mapped Indigenous presence. And you can see as you look closer, both in the labels as well as in the artistry of actual people being painted on this map, a heavily populated North American continent of Native peoples, and very tribally specific. Of course, it takes a little bit of translation finessing because it's in French and they're spelling things in this really weird phonetically way. But it counteracts the assumption that A, this was an empty continent, and B, that even if it wasn't, there just simply wasn't enough knowledge for Europeans or early American settlers to know what tribes were where, what they were up to. Knowing where Native people were in the 17th, 18th century was imperative for survival. Who are you allies with? Who do you have a relationship with? Who, if you go on their territory, are they going to kill you? You know? So this goes back to a really important anthology that I often use in my classrooms called You Can't Teach United States History Without American Indians. And there's one chapter in particular there that talks about the ways that maps in contemporary American history textbooks don't map Indian people. They only map Native absence. Okay, so now that I've gone on about that, I'll actually address the slide. This conference asks what it means to live with treaties. One answer is that treaties are not merely historical artifacts. They're often called Indian treaties, but the United States treaties too, right? They continue to structure Indigenous and non-Indigenous life in the present. And this conference description emphasizes that these treaty histories will shape Native activism, legal struggles, and community life. Some of what's ensconced in these treaties, even when you are federally recognized, is access to traditional territories, whether that means medicines, hunting, fishing, and these continue to be negotiated only because settler folks and settler governments don't understand what these treaties mean and what is supposed to be still accessible to our communities. So to live with treaties is also to live with the unfinished structures of removal and dispossession, but it's equally to live with Indigenous resistance, continuity, and political imagination. Lastly, my central takeaway is this. From a Great Lakes perspective, Indian removal is best understood not only as forced movement, but as a broader attempt to reorganize Indigenous life, land, relations, governance, kinship, and futurity. And yet, communities such as those centered in this panel show that removal never fully achieved its goal. What remained is not only memory of loss, but Indigenous presence, refusal, and future making. This is where I think anthropology and Indigenous futurisms can contribute to this conversation by helping us ask not only how removal happened, but how communities continue to live, interpret, contest, and outlast it. Settler futurity is unspoken and normalized. Indigenous futurity disrupts both the histories, inclusive of or otherwise, and demands that we as Indigenous peoples have a right to exist on our own terms. Thank you.
So anybody have questions? So questions? Amy.
What advice do you have for people who are living without treaties or recognition?
We actually need a microphone, Amy. I'm sorry. Otherwise, because nobody online can hear it.
Oh.
Me, the troublemaker. Yes, thank you for your presentations. They were really wonderful. And my question is, what advice do you have for Indigenous peoples who are living without treaties or recognition?
So I agree, that's a very important question. We have many people in Michigan who experience that. The Burt Lake Band, there are many members of the Burt Lake Band who are not enrolled in the Little Traverse Bay bands, which also identifies the Burt Lake Band as one of its historic bands. So, for example, I'm enrolled at Little Traverse, but they're still seeking federal recognition. And we also have the Grand River Band in Michigan, also still seeking federal recognition. And so throughout the United States, many tribes have been seeking federal recognition for a very long time, and it can cost millions of dollars to be able to assemble sufficient documentation to persuade the folks at the Department of Interior who review the criteria for federal recognition that recognition is required, and that the requirements are satisfied. And so that's a huge challenge, because not having that federal recognition means that a tribe is not able to have its inherent sovereignty recognized by the United States. And so it does not have the forms of civil and criminal jurisdiction that are part of the exercise of that inherent sovereignty. And so that absolutely impairs the ability of the community to pass their own laws and to be able to apply those laws to their community to protect their community's health and welfare and cultural resources and natural resources. So that's a huge challenge. And so one thing, of course, is to support those tribes that are continuing to seek that recognition. And so, for example, the Grand River Band is still seeking federal recognition, and same with Burt Lake. And then in addition to that, I just want to acknowledge that as a result of removal in Michigan's history, we have many, many people, including in the Lansing area. We have a large community of Native Anishinaabe whose ancestors moved to Canada and whose ancestors then were not identified on the Durant roll. And as a result, when those individuals moved back to Michigan, which is where their families are from, they did not have the necessary documentation from the Durant Roll to obtain and qualify for enrollment in the tribes that their ancestors are connected to. And so we've got a lot of folks in Michigan who are historic Michigan Anishinaabe who are not eligible for enrollment because of the effects of removal. And we even have people in Michigan, for example, who are whose ancestors, because they were in Canada, they still have not obtained payment for the Treaty of 1833 cession. They still have not obtained payment, and that payment has been legally recognized as due them, and the money just needs to be appropriated by Congress, and it has not done so. And that doesn't just affect folks who are native in Canada, but I have people, in the Lansing area asking me, what can we do about this? And so that's a real challenge. And they have the burden of having experienced this history of forcible assimilation and removal, and those policies also of forced attendance at boarding schools didn't exempt them because of the fact that they're not enrolled in a tribe. So they experience all those burdens, but they're not able to experience any of the ability to exercise jurisdiction or to be part of a self-governing tribal community. So it's a real challenge.
Sagu, Danny Nyingats. Hi, my name is Danny. I'm an undergrad here at the University of Michigan. I have a question for Blair, if I may. In the context of Indigenous futurisms and digital studies, do you have any thoughts about digital dispossession broadly, but more specifically within like open world media? Or if not that, maybe how tribal archives, libraries, or museums might be using digital tools to engage with Indigenous futurisms?
All right. Is it on? It's on. Okay. Yeah, so I will address the latter because I have more experience in that field. It will be tribe specific. So there are different cultural protocols that dictate how accessible some materials are and whether or not they can be digitized. And Mukadu, which is an indigenous designed content management system made to be flexible depending on the individual indigenous community's needs, is one great example of the ways that people are making their material culture, immaterial culture, more accessible to their communities, especially if you're in a rural community or an indigenous community that has, like mine, 50% or more of their citizens living off reservation or off tribal lands. And so there is definitely a lot of promise for digital tools in order to meet the community priorities, whatever that might be. Repatriating materials from non-tribal institutions, using a digital platform in order to facilitate language revitalization, and we do that through perhaps online dictionaries, et cetera. Because most tribal citizens, at least in my community, do not have the time, bandwidth, or capacity to go into these non-native institutions and access these materials themselves. And so using these platforms in order to meet their needs and what they identify as, but then also not being too Pollyanna or overly optimistic about the use of these tools, especially when we think about generative AI and that sort of thing. But I hope that answers your question. Yeah.
Susan?
Thank you so much for both of your talks. It's such a nice panel to end this conference with. And what uh, I want to highlight something about the role of the imagination in both of your works. The historical imagination that it requires to dig up all of this history, Winona, all the work that you've been doing. It's a imagination that causes one to wonder, right? What happened? All those different things that don't fit within the normal history, right? All the complicated things, and the will to actually find the answers to those questions. And and in the case of Blair's work, I feel like this is also, right, kind of giving permission to imagine beyond the settler plans for Indigenous people, you know, and how much we could even say there's an imaginative sovereignty too. So I just, as a humanities person, I really value what you're doing because of it's not just embedded in the historical record. There's like the exploration of those questions that are historical are driven by the imagination and that futurity that we want to reach. Thank you so
Appreciate
much.
that. Thank you.
If you have thoughts about that, please feel free to elaborate.
Real quick one, just to your point, it's been fruitful to see the ways that even we consider it science fiction, as we should, very enveloped with the colonial project, right? This has been known for a long time that there's a braided history between anthropology, science fiction, and the assumed histories of what we could expect of, say, extraterrestrial visits or something, that somehow they would just be naturally violent the way that colonial nations have been violent. But there's no evidence to support that. In fact, it supports the opposite. But to end my thought, it's been nice to work with language speakers because often we treat language revitalization as this static material or even knowledge that lives in a vacuum and then we need to bring it in and it doesn't change. But obviously we need new words to describe new things in our environment, whether that's a TV, a car, a computer. And I was able to work with a fluent language speaker from my community who I said, I don't know if this is an appropriate question, but obviously I'm writing a lot about Indigenous science fiction and futurisms. It's a really important and emerging genre right now. But would there be a way to describe this genre in our own language? Like, what would be the word? And our typical word for stories, although there's a whole taxonomy of different stories, would be yajmonen, which just means stories. Doings, it could be gossip too. And he gave me the neologism of bakanajmonen, which means stories that make you think differently about stuff. So bakan means like different or speculative. And so that is now our new word for science fiction in Potawatomi, which I think is super cool. Sorry.
So, and then I just want to comment because when you said that what we're doing is also inspired by this question, what happened? And I just want to say that's been a question that's been a burning part of my core my entire life. From the moment when I was 4 and my younger sister was adopted by another family, and I missed my sister my entire life. I wanted to know what happened. And for my whole life, my mother, she was adopted, and she spent her first 5 years living in different foster care homes. And when her adoptive family would come to visit us, because they lived in another state, we would know weeks in advance. She'd start shaking for weeks before they'd even show up at our house. And I wanted to know what happened. And then when I learned that it wasn't just that she was adopted with one of her biological sisters by this family, but that there were 5 kids, and they were all taken, and they were all placed in foster care, and that 2 of them lived in foster care homes until they became adults. I wanted to know what happened. And then I learned from another family member that my mom's mom and dad, Laureen and Hank, they both went to Holy Childhood Indian School in Harbor Springs. Again, I wanted to know what happened. And it's crazy because we didn't grow up knowing any of this. My mom didn't know any of this. And interestingly, when I was in college, there was a class, this was decades and decades ago, but there was a class on Indian boarding schools offered by the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and their word in our native community was, take this class. And I thought, Indian boarding schools, that's got nothing to do with me. What's that? And I didn't take the class. But and so we didn't know what that was at the time. And this was the sort of around like 1992. And so I think that we need not only, so it's a burning personal question, but I also know it's a burning question in all of our communities, that we're all entitled to know, to understand this. And and it helps us understand why our families may have had profound struggles and pain and have, worked their whole lives to sort of live with that pain. And I want to like give them something to help them understand. This is your history, and look at how amazing all of our ancestors are for having survived all of this. Let's understand what happened, and it's an obligation I feel to my community and my family, but it's also, when I read the archives, I love that because it's like I really care so much about those past generations, and I feel an obligation to really tell their stories in a way that the official archive does not. And then, of course, hopefully we can create then something that'll benefit the future generations as well.
Thank you so much for these presentations. I was wondering, Professor Morceau, and maybe also Professor Single, would you be willing to share some of the futures that you're thinking about?
So the really lighthearted, easy question right now. Well, yeah, that's what I love about this reading speculative fiction, because it gives you permission to think, right? And it offers you the space to say, if you could wave a magic wand and change any circumstance, what would that look like? And it might, for me, in the future, a couple generations down the line, maybe we're all having this conference in Anishinaabe instead, right? And like, why is that bizarre, right? It took several generations for us to be fluent, and then birth language being English, maybe we can start to turn the tide a little bit. But I guess I could go on, but we only have a few minutes left, and I want Winona to kind of share her thoughts.
Just that I would like for us to have a deeper understanding that our legal system has caused a cumulative, destabilizing, destructive, harmful impact on Native families from generation to generation to generation, and that has caused a cumulative impact. And I think that we need to think about ways of how we can address that. And I know as a law professor, I deeply understand that the law typically treats harm as something that is specific and that is related to something with a proximate cause that is direct, and it does not fathom the possibility that there could be this sustained harm across 200 and more years, right? Because I just say that because the story I started began in 1840 that I described today, but that and that also could be perpetrated by our legal system itself. And so I want us to understand how the legal system can cause this form of intergenerational harm. And then I'd like to be creative about how we can empower our own tribal communities to use their existing tools and knowledge and insights to be able to provide remedies for that. So, yeah.
Question in the back.
Sorry, just real quickly, as you walk your way up to the next question, I will also want to make the point that not all Indigenous futurisms is utopian. Often we're using this genre to also point to the very specific ways in which historical trauma was enacted and exists into the present. Often a question I get at the end of these is like recommendations for, so after this concludes, the session concludes, I'm happy to make some recommendations for how I use speculative fiction as well as history to teach boarding schools or removal or genocide. So yeah, I just didn't want people to go away thinking that all Indigenous futurisms is just like rainbows and butterflies, so.
Thank you both for the amazing talks. I've been thinking a lot about the Burt Lake because, you know, as one of the several nations actively seeking federal recognition, I'm thinking about what it means when they get federal recognition in this moment. Like what happens at that moment, what changes, what gets reconstituted, right? And then I really was taken by Blair's suggestion that political advocacy is one of the two arms of Indigenous futurisms. And it makes me wonder, like, what are the kinds of policies we should be advocating for? Like, what do we need to be putting in place now to create a strong ground for the future of Indigenous thriving?
So I'll start by referencing what happened when 4 tribes in Michigan had their federal recognition reaffirmed by an act of Congress in 1994. And so at that time, the tribes had been denied their federal recognition due to an incorrect legal conclusion at the agency administrative level. And so Congress had to step in and correct that to say, no, the tribes are sovereigns and we're reaffirming that federal recognition and that sovereignty. And so at that time, there's a designation of what constitutes the tribe's reservation, right? And so in addition, for my own tribe, for example, one of the first important steps was to develop a constitution. And so we had many, community-wide engagement on what would that constitution look like and what should it include, and what were the powers of the legislative body, the powers of the judiciary, the power of the executive, and then, of course, enacting tribal laws and developing our judiciary. So it's nation building from the ground up. It's an incredible amount of work and commitment from many people throughout the tribal community. But those were some of the critical steps. And then, of course, also taking action to protect our children. And so when a tribe does not have federal recognition, children who are from that tribal community, they do not fit the definition under the Indian Child Welfare Act of an Indian child. Because to be an Indian child, you have to be either enrolled in a tribe or the child of a parent who is enrolled and be eligible yourself for enrollment at that child. And so, of a federally recognized tribe. And so, federal recognition is a critical linchpin for a tribe to be able to benefit from the procedural and substantive protections of the Indian Child Welfare Act, and then to enact its own child welfare laws to define and protect children in the community. So it's a very detailed process of nation building at multiple levels. And then of course all of those different tribal governments, various departments that are charged with implementing the various tribal laws enacted by the council with regard to environmental protection, natural resource conservation, and with regard to child welfare and housing and economic development, and with regard to health care and just a variety of different social services and education and cultural resources protection. All of that takes an incredible amount of resources, financial and human resources as well, and training. And so we need our tribal communities to be able to have access to universities that respect that obligation that they have to train our next generation of tribal leaders. But also, there's a lot of resource, and it's a myth to believe that every tribe is suddenly going to be wealthy because of gaming. Gaming resources are very much distributed across the nation in a very unequal way. So if you're located next to a large metropolitan area, you can benefit from a lot of a revenue from tourism and the population centers, but if you're in a remote area of the Upper Peninsula, that's not going to be available to you. And so that's not such a critical source of revenue. And so tribes do a lot of work with the federal government for access to resources and look to other forms of diversified economic development and other resources as well. So it's a long-term process.
We are a little over time, so would you join me in thanking Blair Morsaw, Winona Single, and Mike Wilkins?